The evening sun was setting over the busy streets of Atlanta when Dr. Maya Richardson finished her long shift at Memorial Hospital. After performing a difficult 12-hour surgery that saved the young boy's life, she was looking forward to going home and resting. Her dark blue Mercedes S-Class gleamed under the streetlights as she carefully drove through the city's streets. Dr. Richardson was a respected neurosurgeon with 15 years of experience. At 40 years old, she had worked incredibly hard to reach the top of her field. She came from a simple family. Her mother was a teacher, and her father ran a small grocery store. Through dedication and countless sleepless nights studying, she had graduated at the top of her class from medical school. As she stopped at a red light, she noticed a police car in her rearview mirror. She didn't think much of it at first, but when the light turned green, the police car followed her closely. Dr. Richardson checked her speed and made sure she was following all traffic rules, just as she always did. Still, she had a familiar feeling in her stomach, one she had experienced many times before. Officer James Cooper sat in his patrol car, watching the Mercedes. He was a 45-year-old police officer who had been on the force for 20 years. He prided himself on what he called his cop instincts, though these instincts often came from his deep-seated prejudices rather than actual suspicious behavior. When he saw the luxury car in this part of town, he immediately decided something wasn't right. "Dispatch, I'm going to do a quick check on a Mercedes S-Class." Officer Cooper spoke into his radio. He turned on his flashing lights, signaling for the car to pull over. Dr. Richardson felt her heart sink, but she wasn't surprised. This had happened before, being pulled over for no reason other than driving an expensive car while being black. She took a deep breath and carefully pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to stop in a well-lit area where other cars could see them. Following the safety routine she had learned over years of similar experiences, she turned on her interior lights, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, and reached slowly to turn on her phone's camera. The dashboard clock showed 8:45 p.m. Officer Cooper parked his patrol car behind the Mercedes, leaving his bright headlights on to shine directly into her mirrors. He took his time getting out, walking slowly toward her car while shining his flashlight through her windows. His hand rested near his holster, a detail Dr. Richardson noticed immediately in her side mirror. "Let me see your license and registration," Officer Cooper demanded sharply, not even bothering to introduce himself or explain why he had pulled her over. His tone was harsh and suspicious, a kind of tone Dr. Richardson had unfortunately become familiar with over the years. "Good evening, officer," Dr. Richardson replied calmly, keeping her hands visible on the wheel. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" "I'll ask the questions here," Officer Cooper snapped. "License and registration, now." Dr. Richardson maintained her composure, though her heart was beating faster. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my documents in the glove compartment and my purse. I'm moving slowly so you can see everything I'm doing." She narrated her movements clearly and calmly, just as she had learned to do. Her hospital ID badge hung from the rearview mirror, catching the light from Officer Cooper's flashlight, but he seemed to ignore it completely. As she handed over her license and registration, Dr. Richardson noticed Officer Cooper's eyebrows rise slightly as he read her occupation. She could almost see the thoughts running through his mind as he looked back and forth between her and the documents in his hand. The night was quiet except for the sound of passing cars and the hum of the Mercedes engine. Dr. Richardson sat patiently, her phone still recording, as Officer Cooper walked back to his patrol car with her documents. She could see him in her mirror, talking into his radio and typing on his computer. Little did either of them know that this routine traffic stop was about to turn into something that would change both their lives forever. Officer Cooper sat in his patrol car, staring at the computer screen in disbelief. The registration and license showed that Dr. Maya Richardson was indeed the owner of the Mercedes S-Class. He ran her name through the police database, expecting to find something, anything, that would justify his suspicions. Instead, he found news articles about her achievements in medicine and her work with underprivileged communities. Still unwilling to accept what he was seeing, Officer Cooper stepped out of his patrol car and walked back to the Mercedes. His flashlight beam swept aggressively across the car's interior, looking for any sign of illegal activity. The only things visible were a doctor's coat hanging in the back seat and some medical journals on the passenger seat. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice still harsh. Dr. Richardson took another deep breath, making sure her phone was still recording. She knew this routine all too well. "May I ask why you need me to step out of the vehicle, officer?" she asked calmly. "I haven't broken any traffic laws, and you still haven't told me why you pulled me over." Officer Cooper's face tightened with anger. He wasn't used to people questioning his authority. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Dr. Richardson slowly opened her door and stepped out, standing tall in her professional attire. Her hospital scrubs were visible under her coat, and her surgeon's ID badge caught the streetlight. Several cars passed by slowly, their drivers watching the scene unfold. "Where did you get this car?" Officer Cooper demanded, circling around her like a predator. "How long have you owned it?" "I purchased it 3 years ago from Atlanta Luxury Motors," Dr. Richardson replied steadily. "Officer Cooper, I can see your name tag now. I want to understand why I'm being detained. Is there a problem with my vehicle?" The mention of his name made Officer Cooper even more uncomfortable. He wasn't used to suspects, as he had already categorized her in his mind, being so composed and professional. Her calm demeanor and obvious education challenged his preconceptions. "We've had reports of stolen luxury vehicles in this area," he said, though this was a complete lie. "Your car matches a description." A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, some people taking out their phones to record the incident. Dr. Richardson noticed this and felt slightly safer knowing there were witnesses. "Officer Cooper," she said firmly but respectfully, "I'm the head of neurosurgery at Memorial Hospital. I just finished performing emergency surgery on a 12-year-old boy. I've owned this car for 3 years, as you can verify from the registration you just checked. I believe we both know why you really pulled me over, and it has nothing to do with stolen vehicles." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Some of the bystanders murmured in agreement, and Officer Cooper became increasingly aware of the audience they had attracted. Just then, both of them heard the crackle of the police radio from his patrol car. A dispatcher's voice cut through the tension. "All available units, we have a major accident on Peachtree Street. Multiple injuries reported. Medical assistance needed immediately." Before Officer Cooper could respond, another voice came through. "Dispatch to Unit 247, isn't that your location? We got reports that Dr. Maya Richardson might be in your vicinity. She's needed urgently at the accident scene." The color drained from Officer Cooper's face as he realized the situation he had created. The doctor he had been harassing was actually needed to save lives, while he had been wasting valuable time acting on his prejudices. Dr. Richardson was already moving toward her car. "Officer Cooper," she said, her voice now carrying the authority of a senior surgeon, "you can either continue this unwarranted stop, or you can escort me to that accident scene where I might be able to help someone in need. The choice is yours." The bystanders watched intently, phones still recording, as Officer Cooper stood frozen in his spot. In just a few minutes, his whole world had been turned upside down, and now he had to make a decision that would affect not only his career, but potentially someone's life. Officer Cooper's mind raced as he processed the situation before him. The growing crowd of onlookers, their phones recording every moment, only added to his discomfort. But it was the dispatcher's voice, still crackling over the radio about the accident, that finally pushed him to action. "I'll escort you to the scene," he said to Dr. Richardson, his voice noticeably different from the harsh tone he had used earlier. "Please follow my patrol car." Dr. Richardson nodded and quickly got back into her Mercedes. As she did, another call came through the radio, this time with more details about the accident. A motorcycle had collided with a truck, and the rider was in critical condition. Officer Cooper rushed back to his patrol car, his hands shaking slightly as he grabbed the radio. Unit 247 responding. En route with Dr. Richardson from Memorial Hospital. As they sped through the streets with sirens blaring, Officer Cooper couldn't stop thinking about how differently this evening had turned out from what he expected. He had meant to prove his cop instincts right, but instead, he had nearly prevented a crucial medical professional from reaching an emergency. Dr. Richardson followed the patrol car closely, her medical training already kicking in as she mentally prepared for what she might find at the accident scene. She pushed aside her anger and frustration from the traffic stop, focusing instead on the patient who would need her help. They arrived at the accident scene in less than 5 minutes. The site was chaotic, emergency vehicles with flashing lights, paramedics rushing around, and a small crowd being held back by police officers. The motorcycle lay crushed under the front of a delivery truck, and its rider was being attended to by paramedics. As Dr. Richardson stepped out of her car, she transformed from the woman who had been unfairly profiled into the confident surgeon she was. She grabbed her medical bag from her trunk and rushed toward the accident scene, her white coat flowing behind her. Officer Cooper watched as she took control of the situation immediately. "I'm Dr. Richardson, head of neurosurgery at Memorial," she announced to the paramedics. "What's the patient's status?" The paramedics quickly briefed her on the victim's condition. The motorcycle rider, a young man in his early 20s, had severe head trauma and possible internal injuries. As Dr. Richardson examined him, Officer Cooper moved closer to get a better look at the victim's face. Suddenly, he froze. "Oh my God," he whispered, his face turning pale. That's my nephew, Tommy." Dr. Richardson looked up briefly, seeing the shock and fear on Officer Cooper's face. The same officer who had treated her with suspicion and disrespect just minutes ago was now watching her with desperate hope in his eyes as she worked to save his nephew's life. "He needs immediate surgery," Dr. Richardson declared, her voice clear and authoritative. "The head trauma is severe, and there's likely internal bleeding. Get him stabilized for transport. I'll call ahead to prep my surgical team." As the paramedics rushed to follow her instructions, Officer Cooper stood helplessly nearby, watching the doctor via profile now fighting to save his nephew's life. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. Dr. Richardson pulled out her phone and quickly called the hospital. "This is Dr. Richardson. Clear or 1 immediately. I have a 20-something male with severe head trauma and internal injuries coming in. And Dr. Martinez and Dr. Wong ready to assist. ETA 10 minutes. She turned to Officer Cooper, who looked like he might collapse at any moment. Another officer had come to support him, holding his arm. Dr. Richardson approached them, her voice now gentle but firm. "Officer Cooper, I'm going to do everything in my power to save your nephew. I need you to trust me now, just as you should have trusted me earlier. Can you do that?" The proud officer who had stopped her just moments ago could only nod, tears forming in his eyes. The crowd of onlookers who had followed from the traffic stop watched in silence as the story unfolded before them, witnessing a powerful lesson about prejudice and humanity. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital burst into action as the ambulance arrived with Tommy Cooper. Dr. Richardson had already changed into fresh scrubs and was waiting with her surgical team. She had pushed everything else aside, the traffic stop, the discrimination, the tension, focusing only on saving the young man's life. Officer Cooper had followed the ambulance to the hospital in his patrol car. Now he sat in the waiting room, still in his uniform, his head in his hands. His sister, Tommy's mother, was on her way, but for now, he was alone with his thoughts and regrets. Inside the operating room, Dr. Richardson worked with intense concentration. "Multiple skull fractures," she announced to her team as she examined the CT scan results. "There's significant swelling in the brain, and we've got internal bleeding in the abdomen. We need to work fast." The operating room was filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the focused movements of the surgical team. Dr. Richardson's hands moved with precision and skill as she began the delicate process of reducing the pressure on Tommy's brain. In the waiting room, Officer Cooper couldn't stop thinking about how differently this night could have ended. If he had delayed Dr. Richardson any longer at the traffic stop, if she had been less professional and refused to help after how he treated her, if she hadn't been there at all, he shuddered at the thoughts. "James," a woman's voice called out. Sarah Cooper, Tommy's mother and Officer Cooper's sister, rushed into the waiting room. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hair was messy from rushing to the hospital. "Sarah," Officer Cooper stood up and hugged his sister tightly. "Tommy's in surgery now. The doctor operating on him is one of the best." His voice caught in his throat as he said this. "Tell me everything," Sarah demanded, gripping her brother's arms. "How did this happen? Who's the doctor?" Officer Cooper's face showed shame as he began to explain. "Her name is Dr. Richardson. She's the head of neurosurgery here, and," he paused, gathering courage to continue, "and I almost prevented her from getting to Tommy because of my prejudices." Back in the operating room, Dr. Richardson encountered a complication. Tommy's brain pressure suddenly spiked, and one of the monitors started beeping urgently. "BP dropping," called out the anesthesiologist. "We're losing him." Dr. Richardson remained calm, her years of experience guiding her actions. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine," she ordered. "And get me the ultrasonic aspirator. We need to relieve this pressure now." Her hands moved with incredible speed and precision. Every second counted, and she knew exactly what needed to be done. The operating room fell silent except for the sound of machines and Dr. Richardson's clear, confident commands. In the waiting room, Sarah listened in horror as her brother explained his actions at the traffic stop. "You did what?" she exclaimed, pulling away from him. "James, how could you? After everything Mom and Dad taught us about not judging people." Officer Cooper couldn't meet his sister's eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I know. And now this amazing doctor, this woman I treated so terribly, is the only person who might be able to save Tommy's life." The surgery continued for hours. Dr. Richardson worked tirelessly, her focus never wavering. Finally, after the most critical parts were complete, she stepped back and looked at her team. "Good work, everyone," she said, relief evident in her voice. "The pressure is stabilized, bleeding is controlled. He's not out of danger yet, but he has a fighting chance now." As she stepped out of the operating room, removing her surgical mask, Dr. Richardson took a deep breath. She knew that in the waiting room, she would face the same officer who had profiled her earlier that night. But now, she wasn't just a black woman he had pulled over. She was the surgeon who had just fought to save his nephew's life. The doors to the waiting room were just ahead, and Dr. Richardson could see Officer Cooper and a woman who must be Tommy's mother through the windows. It was time to give them the news about Tommy's condition. Dr. Richardson walked into the waiting room, still wearing her surgical cap. Officer Cooper and Sarah immediately stood up, their faces filled with worry and hope. The doctor's calm presence seemed to fill the room as she approached them. "Tommy is stable," she began, her voice gentle but professional. "The surgery was complicated, but we managed to reduce the swelling in his brain and stop the internal bleeding. The next 24 hours will be critical." Sarah burst into tears of relief, while Officer Cooper stood frozen, his eyes fixed on Dr. Richardson. The doctor continued explaining Tommy's condition, using simple terms they could understand. "He's being moved to the ICU now," she said. "Once he's settled, you can see him. But I want you to be prepared. He's on a ventilator to help him breathe, and there's a lot of equipment monitoring him. This might be difficult to see." Sarah grabbed Dr. Richardson's hands, squeezing them tightly. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for saving my son. I don't know what I would have done if—" Dr. Richardson squeezed back gently. "Your son is young and strong. That's in his favor. Now we need to focus on his recovery." Officer Cooper finally found his voice, though it cracked with emotion. "Dr. Richardson, he started, but she held up her hand. "This isn't the time, Officer Cooper," she said firmly but not unkindly. "Your nephew needs your support right now. We can discuss other matters later." A nurse appeared at the door. "Dr. Richardson, Tommy's been moved to ICU room 412. They're ready for family to visit." Dr. Richardson led them to Tommy's room, explaining what they would see. The young man lay still in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines. His head was wrapped in bandages, and tubes seemed to be everywhere. Sarah rushed to her son's bedside, gently touching his hand around the IV lines. Officer Cooper stood at the foot of the bed, looking lost and overwhelmed. The sight of his energetic nephew, so still and quiet, hit him hard. "Talk to him," Dr. Richardson encouraged them. "Even though he's sedated, hearing familiar voices can be helpful. I'll check back in an hour." As she turned to leave, Officer Cooper followed her into the hallway. "Please," he said quietly. "I need to say something." Dr. Richardson paused, turning to face him. The proud, prejudiced officer from earlier that evening was gone. In his place stood a humbled man who had just learned a powerful lesson. "I was wrong," he said, his voice shaking. "What I did tonight, how I treated you, there's no excuse. And if I had let my prejudice keep you from getting to Tommy—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Dr. Richardson looked at him thoughtfully. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sounds of the hospital at night. "You're right, Officer Cooper. There is no excuse for racial profiling. But tonight isn't about that, it's about Tommy." She glanced through the window at Sarah, who was softly talking to her unconscious son. Tomorrow, when Tommy is more stable, we can have a real conversation about what happened. About why you assumed what you did when you saw me in that car. About how many other black professionals you might have harassed without knowing who they were. Officer Cooper nodded, tears in his eyes. I would like that. And I want to do better. I need to do better. Good, Dr. Richardson replied. Because change only happens when people are willing to confront their own biases. Now go be with your family. Tommy needs his uncle. As Officer Cooper returned to the IQ room, Dr. Richardson watched through the window. She saw him take Tommy's other hand, saw his shoulders shake as he finally let himself cry. She had seen many similar scenes in her years as a surgeon, but this one felt different. Tonight, she hadn't just saved a life, she had potentially changed one as well, and maybe, just maybe, this would lead to changes that went far beyond this hospital room. 3 days had passed since Tommy's surgery. The morning sun streamed through the ICU window as Dr. Richardson checked his vital signs. She was pleased to see continued improvement in his condition. The swelling in his brain had decreased significantly, and his other injuries were healing well. Sarah had barely left her son's side, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair each night. Officer Cooper had been there too, coming straight to the hospital after each of his shifts. But now, instead of wearing his usual proud expression, you watched Dr. Richardson with quiet respect as she examined Tommy. His readings are getting stronger, Dr. Richardson explained, making notes in Tommy's chart. I think we can try reducing his sedation today. He might wake up soon. Sarah's tired face lit up with hope. Really? He's going to wake up? There's a good chance. Dr. Richardson smiled. But remember, recovery from brain injury takes time. When he first wakes up, he might be confused or have trouble speaking. We'll need to be patient. As if on cue, Tommy's fingers twitched slightly. Everyone in the room held their breath. His eyelids fluttered, and slowly, very slowly, they opened. Tommy? Sarah whispered, squeezing her son's hand. Baby, can you hear me? Tommy's eyes moved around the room, finally focusing on his mother's face. He tried to speak but couldn't because of the breathing tube. Dr. Richardson stepped forward, checking his responses with a small flashlight. Tommy, I'm Dr. Richardson, she said clearly. You're in the hospital. Try not to panic. You have a breathing tube helping you right now. Blink once if you understand me. Tommy blinked, his eyes showing fear and confusion. Dr. Richardson continued her examination, asking him to squeeze hands and wiggle toes. To everyone's relief, he responded to all her commands. These are all good signs, she said. I think we can remove the breathing tube now. It might be uncomfortable for a moment, Tommy, but try to stay calm. After the tube was removed and Tommy had taken his first shaky breaths on his own, he looked at his mother and uncle. What happened? He asked, his voice hoarse from the tube. You had a motorcycle accident, Sarah explained, tears rolling down her cheeks. But you're going to be okay. Dr. Richardson saved your life. Tommy's eyes moved to Dr. Richardson, who was adjusting his IV medication. Thank you, he managed to say. Officer Cooper stepped closer to the bed. Tommy, you don't know how lucky you are, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Richardson, she's not just an amazing surgeon. She taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Tommy looked confused, but Dr. Richardson spoke before anyone could explain further. The important thing is that you're recovering well, she said kindly. But no more motorcycle stunts, okay? A weak smile appeared on Tommy's face. No. Promise, he whispered. Over the next few hours, more hospital staff came to check on Tommy. Word had spread through the hospital about what had happened. How the doctor who had been racially profiled had saved the officer's nephew. Many of the black hospital staff had their own stories of similar experiences with law enforcement. Officer Cooper noticed the way some of the black hospital workers looked at him with a mixture of caution and hope. He realized that his actions that night hadn't just affected Dr. Richardson. They were part of a larger pattern that hurt an entire community. Later that afternoon, as Dr. Richardson was finishing her rounds, Officer Cooper approached her again. Dr. Richardson, when you have time, I'd like to learn more. About your experiences, about what I can do to change things in the department. If you're willing to talk. Dr. Richardson studied him for a moment. She had seen real change in him over the past few days. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tommy's doing well enough now. Come to my office tomorrow morning, and we'll have that conversation." As she walked away, Dr. Richardson felt hopeful. Sometimes it took a dramatic event to open someone's eyes to their prejudices, but what mattered most was what happened after those eyes were opened. The next morning, Officer Cooper arrived at Dr. Richardson's office wearing civilian clothes instead of his uniform. He had spent most of the night thinking about this meeting, about all the things he needed to say and learn. Dr. Richardson's office was warm and welcoming, with medical degrees on the walls and family photos on her desk. She gestured for him to sit down in one of the comfortable chairs facing her desk. "Before we start," Officer Cooper said, pulling out his phone, "I want to show you something." He opened a video that had gone viral on social media. It was footage from the night he had pulled her over, recorded by one of the bystanders. "I've watched this video at least 20 times now," he admitted. "Each time, I see something new about my behavior that makes me ashamed. The way I spoke to you, my body language, my assumptions." Dr. Richardson nodded, remembering that night clearly. "That video has over 1 million views now," she said. "People are using it to discuss racial profiling and prejudice in law enforcement. But I'm more interested in hearing what you've learned from it." Officer Cooper took a deep breath. "I've been on the force for 20 years, he began. "I always told myself I was one of the good ones, that I treated everyone fairly. But watching that video, seeing myself through others' eyes, I realized I've been lying to myself." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I saw your car that night, I immediately made assumptions. Expensive car, black driver, that part of town. I didn't see a doctor, a professional, a human being. I saw what my prejudices wanted me to see." Dr. Richardson listened quietly, letting him continue. The morning sunlight filtered through her office windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere for this difficult conversation. Then, when Tommy needed help, his voice cracked with emotion. "You didn't hesitate. You could have refused after how I treated you. Nobody would have blamed you. Instead, you saved his life." "I took an oath as a doctor," Dr. Richardson replied simply, "to help anyone who needs medical care, regardless of who they are or how they've treated me. But Officer Cooper, what would have happened if I hadn't been a doctor? If I had just been another black person in a nice car?" The question hung in the air between them. Officer Cooper shook his head slowly. "I would have made your night miserable," he admitted. "Maybe even found some small reason to write a ticket, and I would have gone home feeling proud of my good police work." "And how many times have you done exactly that?" Dr. Richardson asked gently. Officer Cooper's face showed pain as he remembered similar stops over the years. "Too many times," he whispered. "Far too many times." "The important thing," Dr. Richardson said, "is what you do with this awareness now. Real change doesn't come from one emotional moment. It comes from consistent, conscious effort to do better." Officer Cooper straightened in his chair. "I want to make changes in the department," he said firmly. "We have diversity training, but it's just a box to check. Nobody takes it seriously. But maybe if they heard this story, saw that video, understood how close my prejudice came to costing your nephew his life," Dr. Richardson finished quietly. "Yes," he nodded. Would you be willing to help? To speak to other officers? To share your experiences?" Dr. Richardson considered the request carefully. She had never planned to become an activist, but she understood the power of personal stories to change hearts and minds. "I'll help," she agreed. "But on one condition. This can't be just about making officers feel bad about their prejudices. It has to be about real, concrete changes in how police interact with people of color." Officer Cooper nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. I've already spoken with my captain about reviewing our traffic stop procedures and racial bias training. This could be the start of something important." As they continued discussing plans for police department reforms, both Dr. Richardson and Officer Cooper felt hopeful. Sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the most meaningful changes. 6 months had passed since the night of Tommy's accident. The young man had made an amazing recovery and was back home with his mother, though he had given up riding motorcycles as promised. Today, he sat in the front row of the police department's community center, watching his Uncle James and Dr. Richardson address a room full of police officers. "Many of you have seen the viral video," Officer Cooper said to his fellow officers. But what you haven't seen is how that moment changed not just my life, but our entire department's approach to community policing. The room was packed with officers, community leaders, and local residents. The weekly dialogue sessions that Officer Cooper and Dr. Richardson had started were becoming famous across the country. Other police departments were beginning to copy their program. Dr. Richardson stepped forward to speak. She no longer felt nervous addressing rooms full of police officers. Instead, she felt proud of the changes they were making together. When Officer Cooper pulled me over that night, she began, neither of us knew that moment would lead to all of this. Sometimes the worst encounters can become opportunities for the greatest growth. In the audience, several officers nodded. Many of them had shared their own stories of confronting and overcoming their prejudices during these sessions. The department's statistics showed a significant drop in racial profiling incidents over the past 6 months. Tommy stood up carefully. He still moved a bit slowly, and joined Dr. Richardson and his uncle at the podium. "I don't remember much from the night of my accident," he said to the crowd. "But I know that if Dr. Richardson hadn't been there, if my uncle's prejudice had delayed her even a few more minutes, I wouldn't be here today." The room fell silent as Tommy continued. "My uncle taught me a lot growing up, but his biggest lesson came from that night. He showed me that it's never too late to learn from your mistakes and become a better person." Officer Cooper put his arm around his nephew's shoulders, tears in his eyes. The tough, prideful officer from 6 months ago was gone. In his place stood a man dedicated to making real change in his community. After the session, Dr. Richardson walked to her car, the same Mercedes that had started it all. She smiled as she noticed Officer Cooper's patrol car parked nearby, remembering how differently he had viewed her that night. "Dr. Richardson," a voice called out. She turned to see Sarah and Tommy walking toward her. "We wanted to give you something," Sarah said, holding out a small gift bag. Inside was a framed photo from last week's community picnic, showing Dr. Richardson, Tommy, Officer Cooper, and Sarah all smiling together. Below the photo was an engraved message. "Sometimes angels come disguised as doctors in Mercedes cars." "Your family now," Tommy said simply, hugging her. "You didn't just save my life. You helped my uncle become a better person and officer." Dr. Richardson felt tears in her eyes as she hugged them back. Later that evening, as she drove home, she thought about how much had changed. The police department had new training programs, community engagement initiatives, and accountability measures. Officer Cooper had been promoted to lead these new programs, using his own experience to help other officers recognize and overcome their biases. But more importantly, minds and hearts were changing. The walls between the police and the community were slowly coming down. People were learning to see beyond their assumptions and prejudices. As she parked her car in her driveway, Dr. Richardson looked at the framed photo one more time. The story of that night had spread far beyond their city, inspiring similar changes in police departments across the country. It proved that sometimes the most powerful way to fight prejudice was not through anger or force, but through understanding and transformation. The emergency that had brought them together had become a catalyst for change, turning a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for growth. And in the end, that was the greatest healing of all.